Okay. Is this?
Yep, we're live.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the NOAA Ecosystem-Based Management Seminar Series. My name is Kenrick Osgood. I'm going to be doing the introduction today, subbing in for Peg Brady, who is on travel. So before I get to introducing Tony, just a couple of things. First of all, I just want to mention our next seminar in the EBM seminar series. It's going to be Wednesday, May 8th. It's entitled Tuning Your Ecosystem Status Reports with Fishery Management Council Process, and it'll be presented by Yvonne Duranier from the NOAA Fisheries West Coast Regional Office. And also just mention a couple of logistical things. Please, for the folks in the room here, hold your questions till the end. And for those who are listening via webinar, you're all on mute, so you're not going to be able to ask questions verbally, but you'll just have the opportunity to type questions into the question panel. So with that, let me introduce Tony Marshak, who is our speaker today. Tony works for the NOAA Fisheries Office of Science and Technology within the Marine Ecosystems Division, where he is a contractor working with us. Tony leads the NOAA, he co-leads the NOAA Fisheries Habitat Science Program and collaborates with the NOAA Fisheries Senior Ecosystem Scientist on ecosystem-based fisheries management-related investigations. Tony's research interests include fisheries ecology, the effects of climate change on reef fishes, the influence of habitat, complexity on marine communities, and more recently, investigations into marine socioecological systems. Tony received his BS from Texas A&M University, a master's from the University of Puerto Rico, and a PhD from the University of South Alabama. And then he was a Knaus Fellow in the NOAA Fisheries Office of Science and Technology back in 2014, so in our office then. With that, I think I will let Tony come up and start talking. He is giving a presentation entitled Characterizing and Comparing U.S. Fishery Ecosystems, Successful Factors in Moving Towards Ecosystem-Based Fisheries Management. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kenrick, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I really appreciate it. I want to begin by acknowledging my collaborator, and some have said doppelganger, and by some I mean many, including Jason himself. Dr. Jason Link, our NOAA Fisheries Senior Ecosystem Scientist. He and I have been collaborating on some projects investigating ecosystem approaches to marine resource management. And the bulk of my presentation is going to come from a paper that we put out earlier this year on characterizing and comparing our regional fishery ecosystems and applying this information toward greater understanding of EBFM. And as this seminar series has highlighted through many really fantastic presentations, fisheries management is moving away from a traditional single species approach into a broader and more comprehensive ecosystem-based focus. This is one that addresses the broader issues that are affecting fisheries as well as the cumulative effects of fisheries on a given ecosystem. And these factors include things such as physical processes, the ecological interactions among multiple species and their habitats, and human environment and living marine resource-derived socioeconomics that contribute towards these systems. And given that mouthful of variables that I just mentioned, this requires a systematic and prioritized consideration of these fisheries and factors and incomes and outcomes for a given system. And since we're also seeing high variation among these multitude of interacting factors, as well as differences in approaches and progress towards its overall implementation, the degree to which EBFM is being conducted across the country is not always clear and quite variable among the regions. And as there's differences in the magnitudes of these interactions, this begs a question of what are the determinants of a successful fishery management system and how are they overall interconnected? This NOAA Fisheries infographic really takes us through the different levels of fishery management, whether that being the single species approach, which focuses on an individual species, or moving into ecosystem approach to fisheries management, which accounts for that single species, but also environmental factors such as climate forcing, essential fish habitat, trophic interactions, how they affect the ecology of that single species, and both of these two levels being captured in fishery management plans. As we move into EBFM, this is accounting for interactions among multiple species, particularly how those environmental factors influence those species interactions and captured within a fishery ecosystem plan. And this is also moving toward greater understanding of ecosystem-based management of the system itself, capturing those trade-offs among fisheries and other ocean uses, and moving toward understanding of regional ocean planning as captured through the regional ocean planning bodies as well as the regional ocean plans themselves. So taking this all into consideration, the utility of comparative ecosystem studies really comes into play. And these studies have great value. They allow us to detect some clear patterns as well as lessons that may or may not be transferable across the regions. And they also highlight strengths or areas for improvement as we start investigating what's working in one region, how that transfers to another region, and work toward understanding overarching and regionally specific approaches to management. And we see a lot of disparate and standalone information that's being collected and monitored over time, and this information being incorporated into ecosystem status reports and integrated ecosystem assessments, for example. But we don't necessarily see this being compared across regions and being integrated toward determining some of those overarching factors that work toward facilitating fisheries management, ecosystem approaches, or even working toward developing ecosystem level reference points and overall thresholds for these systems. But this information is very useful in terms of our understanding of the relativity of these processes, how they're affecting the quality and quantity of our living marine resources, and how that translates throughout a given system. Recently, we've been seeing the utility of investigating our fisheries systems as a more comprehensive and coupled or integrated socioecological system, where the natural and human environment is very much setting the foundation for what we see in terms of the status, quality, and composition of our living marine resources, how that translates into overall status of our living marine resource-derived socioeconomics, how governance feedbacks influence very strongly these aspects of the system itself, and how all of this can be determined toward understanding what goes into a successful living marine resource management framework, accounting for biological and ecological sustainability, as well as sustainability of the regulatory and economic components of this system and its overall stability. For the purposes of this talk, however, I want to focus in on these particular components of this pathway by illustrating some relevant portions of these numerous factors that are being considered. We looked at about 90 plus indicators when conducting this study, and really want to hone in on some examples that are relevant to several of our fishery ecosystems. Overall, the objectives of this study that we conducted were to get some consistent and multidisciplinary information that goes towards characterizing these socioecological systems with available data for each of these systems. We looked at the status and trends of each of these systems. We looked at the underlying ecosystem conditions that affect the production of our living marine resources, and then dug in also into aspects of our regional fisheries, their commercial landings, overall stock status, and how this also translates towards fisheries value and overall socioeconomics. We also delved into governance capacity and aspects of the histories of fishery management decisions, and also moved into greater understanding of some of the compositions of institutional managerial bodies, and how this all relates towards the interrelation of these factors. One other thing that we took into consideration was this overall pathway, where we find that the overall production of a given fishery system influences strongly the overall biomass that is available in that system, and also sets the foundation for the exploitation of that system through landings, and translates into the socioeconomics through jobs and economic revenue, with governance feedbacks occurring at each of these steps. So taking into consideration both the bottom-up and top-down forcing that goes into an overall fisheries ecosystem. We conducted these assessments for all 10 of our major regional fishery ecosystems, but for the purposes of this talk, I want to hone in on 4 particular regions: the North Pacific, which will be featured in orange throughout this talk, the Mid-Atlantic, which will be in blue, the Gulf of Mexico in black, and the US Caribbean that'll be in red. So this kind of represents a suite from polar, subpolar, temperate, subtropical, and tropical, and starts examining many of these factors that I illustrated in that pathway. So when we start digging into this overall pathway of a socioecological system, we can hone in on the natural and human environment and many factors that go into these particular systems, whether that be the oceanographic context captured by trends in temperature and salinity, climatological forcing, changes in temperature, characterizing physical features, as well as the destabilizing events, phenomena, and stressors that are affecting these systems. How this is also coupled with aspects of the human environment, whether that be human population, population density, aspects of the scientific operations of a given system, as well as the multiple trade-offs that come into other ocean uses. But I want to focus in on these particular components that I have up on the screen here, and how that ultimately relates to the overall basal production of a given system, and really sets the threshold, the lower level threshold, as we move throughout the consideration of this fisheries ecosystem. So when we see what's going on in terms of temperature for many of our regions, I've got the North Pacific and Mid-Atlantic up here, and we certainly know that there are increasing thermal stressors that are occurring throughout our fisheries ecosystems, particularly in the North Pacific, where we see almost a 2 degrees centigrade increase in annual average sea surface temperature since 1950, about over the past century or so. And this is the second highest that we're seeing nationally. In addition, in the Mid-Atlantic, we're seeing almost a 1 degree centigrade increase in temperature as well. And when we move into the subtropical and tropical regions, we're also seeing thermal stressors that are applied into these regions too, with the U.S. Caribbean being the third highest nationally, with about a 1.6 degree centigrade increase over the past 70 years. So this is to say that we've been seeing quite a bit of thermal stressors occurring in these areas. This is having great implications in terms of the overall productivity for these systems and the overall functioning of the ecology. When we look at other stressors that are affecting the system, we also see increased frequency and intensity of hurricanes, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as high frequency and increasing intensity of hurricanes happening throughout the Mid-Atlantic and U.S. Caribbean, particularly over the past couple of decades. We also see that the U.S. Caribbean being subject to these high thermal stressors. There's also been increasing amounts of coral bleaching that have been occurring, affecting the quality of habitat, as well as the overall functioning of these systems. There are also other factors that are germane to the Gulf of Mexico and the North Pacific, such as high areas of hypoxic waters that occur in the Northwest Pacific associated with the dead zone. And these, the area of these, this area has fluctuated greatly over time, but certainly continues to expand and affect the overall production of that system, and contribute toward other bottom-up forcing into the overall quality and functioning of the system's ecology. In the North Pacific, we also see differing magnitudes in terms of the proportion of sea ice cover, particularly pertinent within the Eastern Bering Sea and the Arctic. And in more recent years, we're seeing greater variability and magnitude associated with these fluctuations. Quite a number of our fishery species, their production is very tied to the proportion of sea ice cover that's available. And this is also creating, having great implications towards the overall system productivity. When we start looking at the human environment, we're also factoring in components like human population density. So in the Mid-Atlantic and U.S. Caribbean, for example, we have the highest and second highest, respectively, coastal population densities that are occurring in these areas. And that's exerting great pressure on these systems. That's also contributing toward greater coastal development, potential eutrophication in coastal areas, and also influencing the degree of overall extraction that is happening in these locations. We also see increases in terms of population density occurring in the Gulf of Mexico, and then also in the North Pacific, where although quite low values for coastal population density are observed, obviously, we have seen a doubling over the past 40 years or so in terms of that, in terms of human population density. So also reflecting the higher level of stressors that are occurring throughout these systems. When we start looking at how this factors in with overall primary production of the system, we do see that generally there's a latitudinal relationship. We see that there's highest primary productivity has been observed over the past 20 years or so within the North Pacific region, followed then by the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast region, and lower overall primary production associated with the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the U.S. Caribbean. And taking these factors into consideration, then we can start looking at how these environmental stressors are correlated and influencing the overall production that we see in that system. So for the North Pacific, for example, while we are seeing that has higher primary production, there's also high influences of sea surface temperature increases. There's also lower factors of human population density. When we start looking at the Mid-Atlantic, we're coupling high productivity also with very high population density, decreases in production in more recent years, and also mid-high hurricane frequency and intensity, and some of the other stressors also influencing overall trends in production within the Gulf of Mexico and U.S. Caribbean. So coupling this information together is giving us an idea of how these factors are influencing overall system productivity and how this translates throughout the fisheries system. So when we start thinking about this in terms of how this is influencing the overall status and composition of our living marine resources, we can start delving into aspects of our targeted resources, our protected resources, bycatch, non-targeted resources, as well as factors that go into our overall system exploitation. And we can pull out a suite of indicators that go into the overall status of overfishing, of how many are overfished, how many for which status is still unknown, trends in commercial landings, and then also move into an understanding of how these exploitations with total landings relate to overall system biomass and production. And these are really important as we start moving away from that single species approach and start thinking about the system as a whole in terms of the amount of cumulative pressures that we're putting on this system, both from natural stressors as well as human anthropogenic fishing stressors. We also tend to see that there is a relationship between the overall production in a system and its related inherent biomass. And certainly within certain tropical systems, we do see an importance of benthic production, and at smaller scales, you may see quite a bit of, you will see higher biomass associated with certain areas for which the inverted trophic pyramid is exerting greater influence on overall system biomass. But in these more temperate regions, we're certainly seeing that the North Pacific, there's a strong relationship between that production and overall biomass, and that this is lower within the Mid-Atlantic as well as the Gulf of Mexico. And taking this into consideration helps us really consider those factors such as extraction and living marine resource dependent socioeconomics, which are ultimately tied into that inherent production of a given system. We can start monitoring this information when we look at the overall relationships among biomass and production, and over time we can see for total biomass to production, these values are actually quite higher within the North Pacific and Gulf of Mexico over time, and lower within the Mid-Atlantic over time. And this is related to the concentration of fishing pressure that has been occurring within these systems, especially in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, where there's been high degrees of concentration of fishing pressure, at times exceeding what's been pointed out as an overall threshold of 1 to 2 metric tons per square kilometer, and then these having significant effects in terms of overall landings as we move into more recent years. And the Gulf of Mexico, as was seen with other regions, we saw quite a large increase in terms of commercial landings pressure and concentrated landings during the 1970s and 80s, leading to overexploitation of that system. Whereas in the North Pacific, we tend to see that increasing fishing pressure occurred during the 1990s and has overall been maintained at certain more sustainable measures. The U.S. Caribbean, however, we tend to see very low landings. And although information is limited back to the 1990s in terms of what is reported to our federal agencies, information that's available through the Department of Natural Resources and other territorial agencies has demonstrated that many of the important stocks, such as groupers and snappers, were significantly overexploited during the 1970s and 80s. And this appears to have driven what we see now in terms of the generally overexploited nature of the U.S. Caribbean. When we factor in what's going on compared to the upper portion of the figure right here, we tend to see that there's a coupling between that historical overexploitation, declines in terms of what's going on with the current status of the aerial exploitation of that system, declines being observed with both the Gulf of Mexico and Mid-Atlantic, and how that translates into overall translation into the biomass and production of these systems, and how also that lower historical exploitation of the North Pacific and generally more holistic measures towards its management tend to have a greater influence in terms of the quality of that biomass to production relationship. We also have to take into consideration, however, the status of these living marine resources, particularly the degree of overfishing and overfished condition that we're seeing with these species, and this is certainly related to historical exploitation in some of these ecosystems. While we have seen trends that are declining in terms of the proportion and number of overfished and species for which overfishing is occurring, we still have quite a few species, especially in the U.S. Caribbean, for which this information is underassessed. We also see that about close to over 80% of these species in the U.S. Caribbean are still of unknown overfished status. And this is very much ties into our ability to move forward in a more comprehensive and holistic fisheries management approach. Overall, again, this gets very much tied into the inherent nature of these systems, the inherent production that's associated with them, and we also see quite a strong relationship between the overall inherent productivity in these systems as related to commercial landings. Certainly, this is also related to factors such as historical overexploitation and governance measures, but we generally tend to see the U.S. Caribbean being fairly low in terms of landings and productivity, and that these factors come into effect more for the Gulf of Mexico, especially, and also in the Northern Pacific, where landings to predict productivity tends to be higher. And then historical overexploitation in the Northeast, also influencing the degree to which we see the Mid-Atlantic being less than predicted along this line based upon its overall inherent productivity. So there's bottom-up and top-down forcing that's occurring in the system that has to be considered as we start moving toward these more holistic frameworks. And we can start looking at this in terms of overall exploitation of the system. When we start relating this to inherent biomass in the system, we can start tracking this over time. And we see, at least for those areas for which we do have good, robust biomass information, we're seeing quite a bit of relative high exploitation of this system. For example, the overall landings to biomass in the Gulf of Mexico, on average, is approaching about that 0.1 threshold that's been identified in the literature as necessary for consideration when setting magnitudes for overall understanding of this fishery system and preventing overexploitations. In the North Pacific and Mid-Atlantic, over time, we're seeing lower values. However, taking into consideration what's been occurring relative to production, we do see that there is still quite a bit of relative high exploitation occurring within the Mid-Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico over time as related to the overall inherent production within that system. In the North Pacific, we're seeing that those values are not quite as high. And then in the U.S. Caribbean, as related to overall inherent production, these values are quite low, also reflecting that inherent productivity buffer that's available in that system is likely to have been exceeded through the historical overexploitation in this less productive region. We start thinking about this as it relates towards overall socioeconomic status. We can start honing in on aspects such as the value of our commercial fisheries and how this relates also to jobs and revenue associated with our living marine resources. And we can start thinking about this in terms of how it's related to that overall inherent biomass and production within the given system. When we start looking at relationships between overall productivity and the job and living marine resource employments, we see that there tends to be a pretty strong relationship, at least in the lower latitude regions and the more heavily populated regions. But when we move into the North Pacific, we actually see a lower number of jobs, obviously related to the lower population density occurring there. But when we actually look at the proportion of living marine resource dependent employments, there's a pretty good relationship occurring there, where the North Pacific is actually contributing up towards about 25% to its total ocean economy in terms of overall living marine resources. These values being up into 90% in the Aleutian Islands, as well as up towards 80 to 90% in the eastern Bering Sea. In the mid-Atlantic, however, we again see that these values are lower than expected, and this is related to multiple factors, but also very much due to the historical overexploitation of this system. When we look in terms of the relative amount of employments to overall biomass, we see that the Gulf of Mexico emerges in terms of this unit relationship with about 2 jobs per 1,000 metric tons of biomass. These values are lower in the mid-Atlantic and much lower given the magnitude of biomass that's associated with the North Pacific and the lower population densities in this region. When we look at this in terms of the relative production, however, of the system, we see that the mid-Atlantic emerges much higher related to the Gulf of Mexico, whereas the US Caribbean and North Pacific have much lower ratios that are associated with these values. And this information is also useful for determining the degree to which these lower level thresholds really factor in toward our overall understanding of, just because an area is doing well socioeconomically, this may also be reflective that these factors that are contributing toward the denominator of these ratios may not necessarily be as plentiful as thought. There's also other market forces and factors related to the overall history of these socioecological systems that play a role in terms of the overall employments, proportional contributions of living marine resources towards these economies, and overall value. We can start looking also at the relationships between that inherent productivity and living marine resources revenue or fisheries revenue, and we see a similar kind of association here with less productive systems generally having lower revenue than what is seen in the Gulf of Mexico and North Pacific and Mid-Atlantic. This also being heavily influenced by historical overexploitation, governance approaches, and other aforementioned factors that go into the living marine resource dependent markets. We can start looking at how these factors translate when we look at information as related to biomass and overall production. And we see that the Gulf of Mexico and Mid-Atlantic emerge in terms of the units of its overall fisheries revenue and as related to its inherent biomass, lower values of these ratios for the North Pacific. And then in terms of overall production, we're seeing quite higher values for revenue within the Mid-Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico as compared to in the North Pacific and US Caribbean. One thing to also point out is that while the proportion of employments is up towards the 22% for the overall North Pacific, towards its total ocean economy, this overall living marine resources revenue, while highest nationally, is about 5% of the total ocean economy, also accounting for other factors such as marine transportation, oil and gas exploration, marine mineral exploitation, and other factors that comprise these total ocean economies. So we've gone through how factors in the natural environment are influencing overall status of our living marine resources, how that also influences the overall status of our socioeconomics, but there's other aspects of governance systems that need to be considered in these frameworks. And this gets into overall factors that comprise the management in these systems, whether that be related to the fisheries or the total system, and then other aspects of these fisheries, of environmental management organization. And I want to call out a few examples here as well, whether that be litigation potential, overall representation among Congress, as well as the fishery management councils and other regulatory institutions, fishery management plans, overall budget that's associated with these institutions, habitat protection influences, and also the degree of closure that's associated with the EEZ in these areas. If we start comparing among these systems, we see in the Gulf of Mexico and North Pacific much higher degrees of lawsuits that have occurred over the past decade, and this is strongly related to the litigation potential. This litigation potential is strongly related to the overall value of the fisheries in these areas. So there's other factors coming into consideration here, that just because you have a high degree of value or biomass in this area, that can also lead to other social implications that go along with how these socioecological systems function. We also see highest degree of percent closures occurring in the North Pacific EEZ, and that HAPSI's, habitat areas of particular concern, emerges very important within the US, Caribbean, and North Pacific. When we look in terms of the number of fishery management plans or modifications that have occurred to these cumulatively, getting an idea of the overall stability that's associated with the system, or the overall attention that's being applied to fisheries in these areas, we generally see that in the mid-Atlantic, there's only 5 fishery management plans that are occurring, as contrasted with the 17 observed in the Gulf of Mexico. There are also, however, a multitude of other ones that are occurring throughout the Atlantic region, as associated with the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission. Overall modifications to these, however, we see a kind of a mid-level, near average level occurring in the mid-Atlantic, as opposed to lower modifications in the US, Caribbean, or high modifications occurring in the North Pacific or New England, where higher levels of contention have occurred, higher degrees of modification have occurred, or perhaps lower attention is being given to some of the plans within the US, Caribbean. And we're also seeing that the US, Caribbean, Mid-Atlantic, and North Pacific are also emerging in terms of the development of their fishery ecosystem plans. US, Caribbean's being in development, the Mid-Atlantic having an ecosystem approach to fisheries management plan that has been produced, and the North Pacific having 2 fishery ecosystem plans for the Eastern Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. When we look in terms of congressional representation to the overall value of fisheries, we see that's highest for the US, Caribbean, as related to that lower value of their fisheries. And we also see a more balanced fishery management council over time occurring in the Mid-Atlantic, with more equivalent representation occurring from both the commercial and recreational sectors, as well as other interests. Higher degrees of representation being observed within the other fishery management councils. And we can take a lot of this information together and start getting a feel for how each of the different regions is operating in terms of its approach to ecosystem-based fisheries management. When we look in terms of the stressors that are being considered and occurring within these different areas, you see the Gulf of Mexico is certainly being subjected to a higher degree of stressors. Governance approaches within these regions tend to be pretty much mid-level. The US, Caribbean actually having a pretty solid approach in some aspects of its governance towards fisheries resources. Productivity being generally low in the Caribbean, mid-level in the Gulf of Mexico, higher in the Mid-Atlantic and North Pacific, and seeing that this is actually facilitating quite a bit of the overall LMR and socioeconomic status that we're seeing in these latter 2 regions. Overall, we see that all regions are doing well in some aspects of considering incorporating ecosystem considerations into their management. When we start looking at what's occurring throughout all of our regions, we tend to see that the Mid-Atlantic as well as the Pacific are emerging as the top 2 areas with mid-high rankings, and then the North Pacific and New England also emerging as in the second tier of out of our total 10 regions. So putting this all back into perspective, looking at that inherent pathway, tracing production through biomass landings and socioeconomics, we see we're seeing pretty good solid relationships among how production relates to biomass, how that relates towards overall extraction and commercial landings of the system, and how this also can relate to aspects of socioeconomics, but also coupling in some top-down stressors such as human population, governance, overall historical exploitation, other components of the human environment, food web interactions, and overall socioeconomics of this system. So all of this put together, considering bottom-up and top-down approaches, is very important toward a more holistic approach to fisheries management. Ultimately, we can take this information from these varying factors that go into this pathway and pull out some indicators that are useful toward understanding overall sustainability from the biological and ecological, regulatory, and socioeconomic variables. whether that be tracing the degree of recovery of stocks over time, how many species are delisted from ESA, accounting for these aforementioned ratios that account for exploitation, socioeconomics related to the inherent production and biomass of a system, the degree of regulatory sustainability, whether that's seen in tracing FMP amendments, lawsuits, and representation per value of fisheries economic status, and then also looking at changes in terms of these socioeconomic factors as we move forward in developing these more holistic strategies. Overall, we see that successful EBFM requires these interdisciplinary approaches considering basal and fishery productivity thresholds, system vulnerabilities, overall fisheries value, and marine gross domestic product. We also need to understand that a lot of this is related to data availability, which is tied closely to funding. In some of these other regions, such as the US Caribbean, data availability has been limited. The ability to conduct these more robust surveys and apply long-term monitoring programs has been can be limited in some aspects, and so continued accounting for ways to improve monitoring programs needs to be considered. We also need to factor in how human population and other congressional and ocean interests are affecting these trends, as well as get higher resolution information into fishing concentrations, the effects of multiple species, and strategic use of closures in terms of its overall effects on the fisheries system. Again, we're seeing that all regions are generally mid-range in terms of how they're conducting EBFM, performing well in terms of certain aspects. We see higher production that's leading to greater LMR and socioeconomic status in the North Pacific and Mid-Atlantic, relatively middle productivity, influencing mid to mid-high LMR and socioeconomic status in the Gulf of Mexico, and then lower production and lower LMR socioeconomic status in the US Caribbean. But the US Caribbean also doing better in terms of some aspects of its governance, whether that be its recognition of the importance of habitat, lower litigation potential, or moving forward in terms of its FEP development and island-based fishery management approaches. We see that overall, some common transferable factors for successful EBFM include having that clear stock status identified and being able to monitor that over time, clearer tracking of broader ecosystem considerations, stable and attentive LMR management interventions, focused more approach on the aerial landings that are occurring in a given system, keeping that below the 1 metric ton per kilometer squared threshold, and then also considering these ratios in terms of exploitation related to biomass and production, as well as explicit consideration of socioeconomics and how this relates to the inherent socioecological system. It's obviously a challenge to examine all of these regional facets, but we're moving forward in greater understanding of overall what is delineating overall fishery success, applying some of these ratios and inherent factors related to these socioecological systems and moving forward. With this pathway, we can certainly look at where certain bottlenecks are occurring or where certain influences are occurring from the system in terms of how that translates into overall living marine resource status or socioeconomic status, how this is related to the inherent and fundamental aspects of that natural system. Also considering the fact that the base of the food web really does set production limits. It's wise to move forward in terms of establishing these ecosystem measures, these ratios especially, when recognizing this and moving forward with more holistic approaches to management. Also considering the influences that these top-down factors, such as historical exploitation, overall system thresholds being crossed over time, and overall governance capacities and frameworks, how they have also been influencing the overall functioning of these systems. We're seeing that these integrated approaches certainly allow for higher level examinations of the trade-offs that are inherent in these systems, allow for greater understanding of these fishery systems, and also help us as we continue to implement EBFM, which is underway, looking at overarching strategies from both a national and for regional perspectives. This work would not have been possible without the essential assistance of so many individuals and institutions who were very sharing of their data sets, allowing us to pick their brains, and also providing and maintaining data sources for us to move forward as we continue to investigate these coupled socioecological systems. We're moving into more multivariate and advanced understanding of the interrelationships between all of these indicators, how they are really driving some of these trends that we're observing, and allowing us to move forward in terms of some of these preliminary observations that we've had. I thank you all for your attention, and I'll try and answer any questions there may be. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it. First of all, let's start off with questions. Any questions we have in the room? Oh.
Yeah, great talk, Tony. Question, you mentioned fishing pressure. How do you quantify that? I presume that's a metric related to fishing effort, and just usually specific to a fishery. How do you quantify that between different fisheries and across different
Right. No, that's a great question.
Repeat the question a little bit.
Yes, certainly. The question was, how do you go about in quantifying fishing pressure, since this can be very much species specific or focused on particular fisheries? What we tend to look at is just in terms of the total metric tons of landings that are being extracted in the given system. We can certainly go into looking at catch per unit effort and some of the other factors that are considered in terms of that, but in terms of looking at that overall relationship of fishing pressure to the inherent biomass and production in the system, we look at the total metric tons that are being extracted. Now, this can certainly vary at different scales, and these are things that we want to move forward in investigating, but at least in terms of looking at everything from a more macro lens, we look at the total extraction through landings.
Okay, so it's more based on extraction than on effort.
Right. Frank.
It's going to get talked about. As part of our greater goal of doing full ecosystem-based management of the oceans, do you think these lessons or the guidance you get out of this could be directly applicable to other sectors at this point? Or, again, I don't know how you put it in terms of productivity, like shipping or something like that, but is it, by and large, you think something that can be implemented by other agencies fairly readily, or is it really going to be difficult?
Okay, so the question's kind of focused on how this information is applicable toward broader ecosystem-based management, taking some of these indicators and trends and applying that towards other sectors, and whether this could also be implemented toward relating inherent properties of the system toward these other ocean uses. I would say that we are investigating some of those relationships among other ocean uses, but I think the degree to which they are interrelated still warrants further investigation. But I think there are factors that we can look at in terms of how certain fisheries are being conducted, where they're being conducted, where the concentrations are occurring, and use that toward better understanding of the trade-offs in these broader systems. So, for example, how marine transportation or oil and gas extraction is relating to the overall extraction potential in this system. I think that this information could be useful toward getting at some of those questions. How oil and gas development is influencing the degree of either fishery harvest or overall production of these living marine resources in a system. I think you can start looking at some of those coupled factors depending on data availabilities from some of these other sectors. And one thing that's really emerging in some studies is also the importance of engaging industry in terms of the importance of ecosystem-based approaches and working toward coupling these factors toward more robust ocean planning.
Question in the back there, and then we'll go to online.
Again, Tony, great presentation. You covered 4 regions. Have you and your colleague already identified future regions you want to address?
So actually in the paper, so the question was, thank you. The question was in this presentation, we covered 4 regions. Have we identified other regions that we want to address? Yes, actually in the paper, we, as I mentioned in the presentation, we covered all 10 major regional fishery ecosystems, characterizing this information and looking at the interrelationships everywhere from the Western Pacific, and we're also doing a deeper dive as we continue to develop other products going into bay and island scales. So for example, Galveston Bay or Mobile Bay in the Gulf of Mexico, other bay systems and island systems throughout the Pacific and North Pacific, and really getting at more of that regional resolution, moving toward that more holistic approach in these in these smaller areas too.
Online,
Yeah.
questions?
Yeah, we have one question online so far, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase it. Since different management councils have different cultures, histories, do the number of management plans under each council, do they have relevance, or how good the governance is? If they have more, management plans, is that a good thing?
Right. No, that's a great question. I would argue that there are certainly some limitations that need to be considered given the causality that goes into the formulation of these plans. But there's also been some work that's been done kind of looking at overall average tendencies for fisheries management plans. And as we're moving towards that broader ecosystem approach, there appears to be some efficiencies that are associated with having fewer plans. There's also some information that demonstrates the importance of having still more tailored species-specific information captured in some of these plans. But I think as we're moving towards that ecosystem approach, it becomes important to account for how these interrelated species are operating, moving into some understanding of these functional groups, how overall extraction potential into different trophic levels can affect the system. And I think there is some utility in terms of moving towards combining some of that information. I think you can complement what's occurring still with the species-specific information and take that into consideration moving forward too. So I think overall there's some good application toward combining both approaches, recognizing what's gone into the bottom-up formulation of these fishery management strategies, but also moving forward with a more broader appreciation of how we can formulate these plans moving forward.
And if I could ask just a follow-up question to that, Tony, just if I recall, looking at your presentation, as far as fishery management plan modifications, I think the Caribbean had about 30 modifications-ish, and the North Pacific was more around 300.
Right.
What was the time frame over which those number of modifications had happened?
Yeah, the time frame for that was based upon the inherent, since the development of those plans, accounting for the total amendments, regulatory amendments, frameworks, all of those modifications that have occurred since the initial formulation of those plans. And overall, what we tend to see is that there is some degree of relationship between how many modifications have occurred. There's a balance between how much attention is going into fisheries in that area versus the degree of unsustainability and contentiousness that's associated with some of these fisheries. The more modifications tend to occur, but there's also understanding of the importance of these other inherent drivers in the system that allow for those modifications to also occur. So it's trying to find that kind of a balance. But yeah, the framework, the timeline in which we operated was since the inception of these plans.
Other questions from the room?
We do have a few more online.
Online?
Yes. So we had a question about employment data from Alaska and how you obtain that data, and they were concerned that many researchers use the ASC survey and it's not representative of the entire state because of the population size. Mm-hmm. And what your thoughts are on that.
Right, that's a great question. While we looked at aspects of the federal surveys, we also looked at information that's being housed by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and state agencies in that region to try and get at total understanding of overall landings in the area. But yes, we're certainly cautious of the fact that the overall accuracy of some of these data sources in various regions may require some broader correction factors.
One more question online. Could you kind of explain a little bit more how the metrics can translate into FEPs, especially related to non-targeted species and or species habitat relationships?
That's a great question. Yeah, we have some of that information that we looked at in the broader assessment and in the paper, especially in terms of overall bycatch and discards that are being related. Some of the issues, however, that we see, at least in the reporting, is that a lot of that reporting has been hasn't necessarily been conducted over some of the larger time frames. But this information can very much go in toward understanding those differential sources of pressures that are occurring in a given system. And then in terms of overall relationships of habitat, we're continuing to move forward in terms of getting at those broader assessments of how habitat factors are influencing fisheries productivity, getting that at that higher level essential fish habitat data and information. But we've got a ways to go as we continue to move forward in those regards. I think, however, their potential and understanding of that is becoming a bit more broadly appreciated, and I'm optimistic that that information can be tied into FEPs moving forward.
That's it for me online.
Okay. Well, with that, I want to once again thank Tony for his presentation, and once again remind everybody of the next month's seminar is going to be Wednesday, May 8th again, entitled Tuning Your Ecosystem Status Report with the Fishery Management Council Process, presented by Yvonne DeRainier from the NOAA Fisheries West Coast Regional Office. So thank you both in person and folks on the webinar.
Thank you so very much. Appreciate it.